Imagine the far north before dawn. The sky is still dark. The sea is black beyond the shore. A cold wind moves over rocks, frozen grass, and the narrow spaces between wooden buildings. Somewhere in the distance, waves strike the coast with a slow, heavy rhythm, as if the ocean itself is breathing in its sleep. Inside a longhouse, night has not fully ended. The air is warm near the hearth, but cold waits at the edges of the room. Smoke rises from the fire and gathers beneath the roof beams before finding its way out through small openings above. The smell of ash, wool, dried fish, damp wood, and sleeping bodies fills the house. People lie close together beneath cloaks and rough blankets, not because it is comfortable, but because warmth is something a family shares. A child turns in sleep. An old man coughs softly. A dog lifts its head, listens to the wind, and lowers it again. Outside, the world is hard and dark. Inside, the fire is low, and the people are still. This is where the story begins. Not with dragon-headed ships cutting through mist, not with warriors landing on foreign beaches, not with silver kings, sagas, or the fear of northern sails appearing on the horizon. Before all of that, there were cold homes, poor farms, short summers, long winters, and families trying to survive at the edge of a difficult world. Before they became sea kings, they were people of smoke, wood, wool, hunger, weather, and water. That is the quiet rise we are going to follow tonight. The rise of a northern world that began in harsh settlements and slowly became one of the most famous sea powers in history. A world where the land was never quite enough, where the ocean was first a boundary, then a road, then a source of wealth, fear, and power. And if these calm stories help you rest, you can subscribe and let me know where you are listening from tonight. For now, stay inside the longhouse. Listen to the wind. The walls are made of timber, but they do not fully keep the cold away. The roof creaks, the fire shifts, smoke darkens the beams above. Around the hearth, tools hang from posts. Nets may be folded near a wall. A shield might rest among ordinary objects, not yet as a symbol from legend, but as one more thing a person might need in an uncertain world. There is nothing here that looks like empire, nothing here that explains at first glance how people from these northern settlements would cross seas, enter rivers, settle islands, trade across continents, and leave their mark from the North Atlantic to the edges of Byzantium. From inside this house, the future looks small: a winter to survive, animals to feed, wood to gather, boats to repair, food to preserve, children to raise, the sea to watch. This is important because the Vikings were not born as legends. They were made by place, pressure, skill, and need. The word itself would later be tied to voyagers, raids, ships, and fear, but the people behind that word came from ordinary northern communities. They were farmers, fishers, traders, craftsmen, storytellers, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and young men looking for a future beyond the narrow limits of home. Their rise was not a sudden storm. It was a slow gathering of wind. For generations, people in Scandinavia lived with a simple truth. The land could feed them, but not easily. In some places, fields were small, soil was thin, winters were long. A bad harvest could tighten life around a household like a rope. Wealth was limited. Opportunity was uneven. A younger son might look at the family land and understand that there would not be enough for everyone. But beyond the shore, the water stretched outward, cold, dangerous, unforgiving, and full of possibility. At first, the sea was not a path to glory. It was part of daily survival. It gave fish. It gave routes between nearby places. It connected fjords, islands, settlements, and coasts. It demanded skill from anyone who wanted to live beside it. A person had to understand wind, tide, current, wood, rope, sail, cloud, and the shape of the shore. The sea punished carelessness, but it rewarded knowledge. Slowly, the people of the cold north learned its language. They learned how a boat sits in water, how a coastline changes in fog, how weather can shift before the sky fully shows it, how to move not only across land, but across waves, how to leave one shore and trust that another shore exists beyond the dark line of the horizon. This is one of the first great steps in their rise. The sea stopped being only an edge. It became a road. And when a poor or crowded world discovers a road, everything changes. A road means movement. Movement means trade. Trade means silver. Silver means status. Status means followers. Followers mean power. And power, in time, can turn cold farmers and coastal sailors into something much larger than their beginning. But in this first chapter, we are not there yet. We are still in the Longhouse before the storm. The people inside do not know how future centuries will remember them. They do not know that their descendants will be imagined as raiders, explorers, settlers, traders, kings, and ghosts of the northern sea. They only know the weight of the present, the dark morning, the low fire, the work waiting outside, and the cold world pressing against the walls. A woman rises before the others. She moves carefully so she does not wake the children. The fire needs attention. The house needs warmth. Food must be prepared. Someone will have to check the animals. Someone will go toward the shore. Someone will look at the weather and decide whether the sea can be trusted today. The day begins with work, not legend. This is where successful survival is born, in repeated tasks, in hands that know rope and wood, in bodies used to cold, in people who understand that one mistake in winter can matter for weeks, in families who learn to store, repair, share, and endure. The later Viking world did not rise in spite of this hard life. It rose from it. The cold made people practical. The land made them restless. The sea made them skilled, and distance made them curious. Beyond the walls of the Longhouse, the coast waits. Dark water lies under the fading stars. Somewhere near the shore, a boat rests above the tide. It may look small now, simple, ordinary, part of daily life. But in the story of the North, the boat will become the bridge between poverty and power, a way to fish, a way to trade, a way to raid, a way to settle, a way to become known far beyond the villages where the story began. For now it is only wood near the water. For now the people are only waking. For now the sea is still dark. But the wind is changing, and over many generations that wind will carry them farther than anyone in this longhouse can imagine. From frozen homes to open water, from small farms to distant shores, from survival to reputation, from the smoke of the hearth to the age of sea kings. Tonight we begin before the sails rise, before the silver, before the fear, before the maps of Europe begin to change. We begin with a cold house in the north, a low fire, a sleeping family, and the dark sea waiting beyond the door. Because every impossible rise has a humble beginning, and the rise of the Vikings began here, in the quiet before the storm. Before the Vikings were Vikings, they were people of the north. They were not born inside legend. They did not begin as one army, one kingdom, or one people waking with the same purpose. They came from scattered farms, coastal settlements, fjords, islands, forests, and valleys, where life was shaped by weather, land, family, and the sea. Long before their ships appeared on distant shores, there were ordinary mornings, smoke rising from longhouses, animals moving in the cold, hands repairing tools, women preparing food, men checking boats, fences, and fields. Children learning early that winter was not an idea, but a force that entered every wall, every bed, and every plan for the year ahead. This is the part of the story that often disappears behind the legend. When people hear the word Viking, they often imagine the final image first. Ships, axes, raids, treasure, burning monasteries, fierce warriors under grey skies. That image is powerful, and it became famous for a reason. But it is not the beginning. The beginning was smaller, quieter, poorer, more human. The people who would later be remembered as Vikings lived in a world where survival required many skills at once. A man might farm, fish, trade, repair a boat, carry a weapon, and sail when the season allowed. A woman might manage food, cloth, household labor, children, animals, and the memory of what the family would need when winter came. A child might grow up learning not one simple role, but a whole web of necessary work. Life did not divide itself cleanly. The North demanded flexibility. A household had to be practical because the land did not forgive waste. Wood mattered, iron mattered, rope mattered, wool mattered. A preserved fish, a sealed jar, a repaired tool, a sound plank, a healthy animal, each small thing could become important when the cold returned. Before the Vikings became sea kings, they became survivors. That is the foundation of their rise. Not glory, not conquest, survival. Imagine a small farm near a fjord. The house is long and low. The roof is heavy. Smoke stains the inside beams. Outside the ground is uneven, perhaps thin, perhaps stubborn. There may be fields, but not endless fields. There may be animals, but animals need food too. The sea is near, but the sea is never gentle, just because people depend on it. The family living there does not think of itself as part of a future age that others will name and study. They think about the coming season, the harvest, the boat, kin, neighbors, debts, honor, food, weather, and luck. This world was not empty of ambition, but ambition had to grow from hard ground. Some people had more than others. Some families had better land, more animals, stronger alliances, better ships, more silver, more followers. Power existed in the North before the great voyagers, but it was local, personal, and often fragile. A household might rise or fall. A young man might inherit land, or inherit almost nothing. A family might be secure one year and strained the next. This unevenness mattered, because when a world has limited land and growing pressure, people begin to look outward. A younger son with little hope of inheriting enough land might look toward the shore. A skilled sailor might understand that a boat can carry more than fish. A trader might hear of wealth across the sea. A leader might realize that followers can be gathered if he can promise silver, adventure, land, and a name worth remembering. But before any of that could become history, the people of the North had to be shaped by their own environment. They had to become hard to surprise. Winter teaches that. A long winter is a slow teacher. It teaches planning. It teaches patience. It teaches that warmth must be stored before cold arrives, that food must be preserved before hunger arrives, that tools must be repaired before they break at the worst moment. It teaches a household to think ahead, and a people who think ahead can become dangerous when they turn that habit toward the sea. The northern world also taught people to live close to uncertainty. Weather could change, crops could fail, animals could die, a boat might not return. A person could leave in one season and come back with goods, wounds, stories, or not at all. Uncertainty did not make them fearless. It made them familiar with risk. This is important because later, when ships crossed open water toward unfamiliar coasts, that courage did not appear from nowhere. It grew out of daily life beside danger. A person who has spent years reading weather, handling boats, enduring cold, and repairing what breaks has already learned part of the language of risk. The later Viking voyages were extraordinary, but they were built on ordinary experience. Fishing close to shore, traveling between settlements, carrying goods across water, visiting kin across fjords, following coastlines, learning where the sea hides rocks, where currents pull, where fog gathers, and where the wind changes before a storm. These small journeys were the school before the great ones. So before the Viking Age became visible to the rest of Europe, something was already forming in the north. Not yet an empire, not yet a terror, not yet the world of sagas and kings. A culture of movement, a culture of practical skill, a culture where the sea was not only a barrier, but part of the neighborhood. This is why the word Viking can be misleading if we imagine it as a whole people from the beginning. Many people in Scandinavia never went raiding. Many lived and died as farmers, fishers, craftspeople, traders, parents, and neighbors. Viking was connected to activity as much as identity. going out, voyaging, seeking wealth, taking risk across water. The legend grew from those who left, but those who left were shaped by those who stayed. The longhouse made the sailor, the farm made the raider, the winter made the planner, the shoreline made the traveler, and the limits of home made the horizon more powerful. Inside these northern communities, stories also mattered. People lived in a world rich with memory, ancestors, gods, spirits, honor, feuds, gifts, promises, and names that needed to be remembered. A person did not live only for comfort. Reputation mattered, courage mattered, loyalty mattered, generosity from a leader mattered. A young man might want silver, but he might also want a name that would be spoken after him. This hunger for reputation would become one of the winds behind the Viking rise. Not the only wind, but an important one. A dangerous voyage is easier to imagine when it promises more than goods. It promises status. It promises a place in stories. It promises that a person born in a narrow world might become larger than the farm that raised him. Still, we should not rush too quickly toward the ships. At this point in the story, the northern world is still mostly local. The sea is close, but not yet fully conquered. Boats are useful, but not yet the great symbol of an age. Foreign wealth exists in rumor, trade, and occasional contact, but it has not yet transformed the rhythm of life. The people are still waking in longhouses, still tending animals, still watching weather, still repairing wood and iron, still living with the same question every hard land asks its people: how do we make enough from what we have? And slowly the answer begins to change. At first the answer is work the land, then use the shore, then follow the coast, then cross the water, then return with something the land could not give. That is the movement from survival toward expansion. The Vikings did not rise because they were simply violent. Many peoples were violent. Many lands knew conflict. Violence alone does not explain how northern sailors reached so far, adapted so quickly, traded so widely, settled so many places, and became part of the political future of Europe. Their rise came from a combination of pressures and skills: hard land, cold seasons, local ambition, seafaring knowledge, flexible households, craftsmanship, kinship, trade, the hunger for silver, the hunger for land, the hunger for a name. When these forces came together, the northern world began to open, not all at once, not everywhere in the same way, but slowly, like ice breaking at the edge of spring. Before the sails rose, before distant churches heard the warning of ships, before sea kings ruled coasts and kingdoms, there were people learning to survive in a place that gave them enough to live, but not always enough to stay small. That is the second step in their quiet rise. First the longhouse, then the world that made the longhouse restless. Because once a people can endure the cold, repair the boat, read the water, and imagine a life beyond the shore, the sea begins to change. It is no longer only the edge of home. It becomes the way out. Every rise begins with pressure. For the people of the north, that pressure was not only hunger, ambition, or the dream of silver beyond the horizon. It was the land itself. Scandinavia was beautiful, but beauty did not make it easy. It was a world of fjords, forests, mountains, rocky coasts, cold water, short growing seasons, and long stretches of weather that could turn ordinary work into a test of patience. The land could feed people, but rarely without struggle. It could hold farms, but not always enough. Good farms for every household, every son, every family hoping to grow. In softer lands, a community might expand by clearing more fields. In warmer lands, harvests might be kinder. On broad plains, a family could look outward and imagine more room. But in much of the north, the earth placed limits around people. The soil could be thin, fields could be small, stones had to be cleared, forest had to be cut, animals had to be protected through winter, hay had to be stored before the cold came. A poor season could make every decision sharper. A household had to ask not only what it wanted, but what it could afford to risk. This kind of land does something to people. It makes them practical. It makes them watchful. It teaches them that survival depends on preparation. And when the land gives only so much, people begin to look toward what lies beyond it. For Scandinavians, beyond the land was the sea. At first, the sea may have seemed like a boundary, a dark edge at the end of the farm, a cold and dangerous place where storms rose quickly and a careless person could disappear. It was not gentle. It did not promise safety. It could take a boat, a father, a brother, a son, and return nothing but broken wood or silence. It gave fish. It gave seals, whales, birds, driftwood, and routes between places where land travel was slow or difficult. It connected fjords, islands, settlements, and coasts. A fjord could reach deep inland like a road of water. Islands could become stepping stones. Broken coastlines could become paths for those who knew where to land. This is one of the quiet secrets of the Viking rise. The sea was first a necessity, only later did it become power. A child growing up near a fjord would learn the water as part of home, not as an adventure, not as a line on a map, but as daily reality, the smell of salt, the sound of waves against stone, the pull of a boat on a rope, the way wind changes the surface of water, the way mist hides the shore, the way adults look at the sky before deciding whether a crossing is wise. This knowledge begins small, a short trip across a fjord, a fishing journey close to shore, a visit to kin in another settlement, a load of goods carried by water because walking would take too long. But small journeys teach large lessons. They teach balance. They teach timing. They teach trust in wood, rope, sail, and human hands. They teach that the horizon is not an end, it is a question. And once a people becomes comfortable asking that question, the world begins to widen. The northern landscape did not push everyone to become a raider, trader, or settler. Many people stayed close to home all their lives. They worked the same fields, tended the same animals, and lived within the same local networks as their parents and grandparents. But for some, the pressure of the land made the sea feel different. A younger son with little inheritance might look toward the shore with hunger. A skilled boatman might see not only danger, but distance. A leader with ambition might understand that wealth could be gathered beyond the local farm. A poor household might hear stories of silver across the water and imagine a future the soil could not provide. The land created limits. The sea suggested escape. And between those two forces, the Viking world began to form. Expansion rarely begins with one clear decision. More often, it grows from many small pressures pressing in the same direction. Too little land, too many ambitions, too much knowledge of routes beyond home, too many stories of places richer than your own. Pressure builds slowly, like snow gathering on a roof, like ice thickening on a fjord, like wind strengthening before a storm. By the time northern ships began appearing on distant shores, the forces behind them had already been forming for generations. In the north, water-shaped movement. Boats were not rare miracles. They were tools of life. Some were small and local. Some traveled farther. Some carried people, animals, goods, news, and the quiet understanding that one world could touch another through water. This made Scandinavia different from a landlocked world. A difficult field might limit you, but a boat could carry you around that limit. A mountain might block a road, but a fjord could open a path. A poor harvest might trap a family, but a voyage might bring what the farm could not. Slowly the sea became not only the edge of the north, but its greatest opening, and the people who lived beside it became students of movement. They learned coastlines before they learned distant kingdoms. They learned how a sail feels when wind fills it. They learned the weight of oars in cold hands. They learned how to beach a boat, repair a hull, read clouds, watch birds, and listen to older sailors who knew when the water should not be trusted. This was not glamorous knowledge, it was working knowledge, the kind that keeps people alive. But in time, working knowledge can become historical power. Because when a community has enough people who can build boats, repair boats, sail boats, navigate coasts, endure weather, and return with goods. It has already created the foundation for something larger. It has created the ability to move beyond its own limits. That is why the harsh northern land did not simply hold the Vikings back. It shaped the skills that carried them forward. The cold taught endurance. The thin soil taught restlessness. The coastline taught movement. The sea taught scale. And the combination of all these things made the North a place where a small settlement could dream beyond itself. Imagine the view from a farm near the water. Behind you, the land is familiar but narrow. A house, a field, animals, tools, kin, obligations, winter stores. Ahead of you, the sea is dangerous but open. It does not promise success, but it offers direction. Somewhere beyond sight, there may be richer lands, different markets, weaker targets, new allies, new enemies, new futures. For a long time, that promise may have been only a whisper. Then it became a route, then a habit, then a system, and eventually an age. The Viking rise was not born only from violence. It was born from geography, turned into skill. It was born when people living in a hard northern world learned that the things surrounding them, threatening them, and feeding them could also carry them outward. The sea was not easy, but it was open. And for people whose land could feel narrow, openness was powerful. So before we speak of raids, silver, longships, and kings, we have to understand this deeper beginning. The North did not simply produce warriors. It produced people who could not ignore the sea. People who learned to read it, fear it, use it, and eventually trust it enough to follow it farther than their ancestors had gone. The land pushed them, the sea received them, and between the two, the first shape of the Viking world began to appear. But knowing the sea as a road was only the beginning. To travel farther, return richer, and reach places that seemed impossible from the cold farms of the north, they needed something more than courage. They needed ships capable of changing the size of their world. Before the Longships became famous, before northern sails appeared on distant horizons, there was daily life in the cold north. It was not a life made of constant battle. It was not the simple image of men waiting with weapons beside the sea. It was slower than that, harder than that, and more ordinary. It was a life of smoke, weather, hunger, repairs, animals, wool, wood, iron, and fire. Inside a longhouse, the day began before the sun gave much warmth. The hearth was the center of everything. It cooked food, gave light, dried damp clothing, warmed sleeping bodies, and turned the inside of the house into a place where winter could be endured. Smoke moved through the beams. Shadows rested in the corners. The smell of ash and stored food mixed with the smell of people and animals living close together. A longhouse was not only a building, it was a small world. In winter, that world could feel especially close. Outside, wind moved over frozen ground. Snow or cold rain might cover the paths. The sea could be too dangerous to cross. Fields waited beneath darkness and frost. Animals needed care. Wood had to be gathered, saved, and used carefully. Food stores had to be watched with patience. Inside, life gathered around heat. Children learned early that warmth was not automatic. It came from work. Someone had to keep the fire alive. Someone had to cut wood. Someone had to mend the roof, repair tools, patch clothing, prepare food, and make sure the household could last until the season turned. This is important because the Viking rise did not begin with ease. It began with people trained by difficulty. A person raised in this world learned to notice small things. A crack in a tool, a change in the wind, a sick animal, a rope beginning to weaken, a roof beam that needed attention, a store of grain or dried fish that was lower than it should be. In a forgiving world, small mistakes may disappear. In the cold north, small mistakes could grow teeth. So people became careful, practical, watchful. They learned not to waste. They learned to repair before something broke completely. They learned that survival was not one heroic act, but 1,000 ordinary acts done on time. Food was one of the great concerns of this life. There might be grain if the land allowed it. There might be fish from the sea, meat from animals, dairy, preserved foods, berries, roots, and whatever the household could gather, raise, trade, or store. But food was not simply eaten. It had to be planned through seasons. It had to survive cold, dampness, animals, spoilage, and the long stretch between one good season and the next. A household that ate carelessly in autumn could fear the end of winter. So the rhythm of life was shaped by preparation. Harvest when there is harvest. Dry what can be dried. Salt what can be salted. Store what can be stored. Repair what will be needed later. This slow discipline would matter when the northern world began to move outward. The same habits that helped a farm survive winter could help a ship survive a voyage. The same respect for preparation that kept a family alive through cold months could help a crew cross water and return. The Sea Kings were not made from comfort. They were made from people who understood that nothing important survives without maintenance. Daily life also trained the body. Work in the north was physical. Hands learned weight, texture, and resistance. The weight of an axe in wood, the pull of an oar, the tension of rope, the roughness of wool, the cold bite of iron, the wet heaviness of nets, the ache of carrying, cutting, lifting, rowing, and building. These were not separate from the later Viking world. They were its foundation. A person who can repair a roof in winter can learn to repair a ship. A person who can read weather for livestock can learn to read weather at sea. A person who grows up around tools, animals, boats, and wood is already living inside a school of practical skill. Even the Longhouse itself taught lessons about community. People lived close together. Privacy was limited. Work was shared. Stories were told near the fire. News traveled from visitor to visitor. Children listened to adults speak of kin, honor, debts, voyages, feuds, marriages, gods, luck, and the strange things that might wait beyond the known coast. In such a place, memory mattered. A household did not live only in the present. It lived with ancestors, names, old promises, old conflicts, and old stories. A child might hear of a relative who sailed west, a trader who returned with silver, a leader who gave gifts generously, or a man who failed because he was careless, cowardly, or unlucky. Stories shaped ambition. They taught what was admired: courage, loyalty, cleverness, endurance, generosity, skill. These values would later travel with ships, but first they lived beside the fire. It is easy to imagine a young person sitting in the half-light of the Longhouse, listening while an older voice speaks. Outside, the wind presses against the walls. Inside, the fire lowers and rises. The story may be about a voyage, a feud, a bargain, a storm, a gift, a god, or a distant market where silver moved from hand to hand. The child may not yet know that the world is wide, but the story begins to make the horizon larger. This is another hidden part of the rise. Before people travel far, they have to imagine distance. They have to believe that beyond the familiar shore, there are places worth reaching. Stories make distance possible in the mind before ships make it possible in the body. The cold north gave people hardship, but it also gave them long hours indoors when stories could grow. In winter, when the land rested and travel became difficult, words could carry people farther than feet. Memory kept rotes alive. Reputation kept ambition alive. Tales of wealth, courage, and distant places made the world beyond home feel real. Daily life was also tied to craftsmanship. A northern household depended on makers, people who could work wood, bone, leather, wool, metal, and rope. A ship did not appear from nowhere. A sail did not weave itself. An iron rivet did not shape itself. A blade did not sharpen itself. A chest, a sled, a harness, a shield, a handle, a plank, a mast, each came from knowledge held in hands. The rise of the Vikings depended on this world of skilled making, not only warriors, makers. The builder who understood wood helped open the sea. The smith who shaped iron helped secure the ship. The weaver who made cloth helped make the sail. The farmer who produced food helped feed the crew. The family that maintained the home made it possible for someone to leave and return. No rise belongs only to the people who become famous. Behind every ship leaving the north was a whole world of labor. This is why the image of the Viking as only a raider is too small. The raider was one expression of a much deeper society. Beneath the raid was the farm. Beneath the sword was the forge. Beneath the sail was the loom. Beneath the voyage was the household that had learned to survive in a hard place. And because life was hard, success had meaning. A person who returned with silver changed more than his own fortune. He brought proof that the world beyond the sea could answer the hunger of the land. Silver could become jewelry, gifts, trade, status, followers, influence. It could help a leader appear generous. It could make a household stronger. It could turn a voyage from risk into possibility. But before silver could matter, the household had to produce people capable of reaching it. That is what daily life did. It made the North disciplined. It made it skilled. It made it restless. It made the sea feel necessary. Imagine the Longhouse again, not as a poor hut, but as the first engine of the Viking world. Inside it, children learned cold. They learned work. They learned stories. They learned closeness. They learned the value of tools, food, fire, memory, and trust. They learned that home was precious because it was difficult to keep. And from that difficult home, the desire to move outward could grow. Not everyone would leave. Most life still belonged to farms, families, and seasons. But enough people would look toward the sea with a different hunger. Enough would learn that a boat could carry them beyond the limits of the land. Enough would discover that the skills of daily survival could become the skills of travel, trade, raiding, and settlement. The rise was still quiet, still hidden in ordinary life. A repaired oar, a stored meal, a story beside the fire, a young person watching the shore, a boat pulled above the tide, waiting for weather. Inside those ordinary things, the future was gathering. The cold north was teaching its people how to endure, and endurance, when joined with wood, water, and ambition, would soon become movement. Before the Vikings could become masters of the sea, they had to become masters of survival at home. And in the Longhouse beside the low fire, that lesson was learned every night. Before the sea became a path to distant kingdoms, it was a path between nearby shores. This is important to remember. The Vikings did not begin by crossing the whole world. They began by learning the water close to home. A fjord, a bay, a river mouth, a crossing between islands, a familiar stretch of coast where rocks waded beneath the surface, and the wind could change quickly. Long before a northern ship frightened a monastery or reached a foreign market, someone had to push a smaller boat into cold water for ordinary reasons. To fish, to visit kin, to carry food, to move animals, to trade a little, to cross where walking would take too long. The first wooden roads were not roads in the usual sense. They had no stones laid in a line, no gates, no dust rising beneath feet. They were paths of water, known by memory, weather, and practice. You could not see them unless you knew how to read the shape of the coast, the pull of a current, the color of waves, the angle of wind, and the meaning of clouds. But to people who lived beside the sea, these paths were real. A boat could make a scattered world feel closer. A farm across a fjord might be difficult to reach by land, but reachable by water. An island might seem isolated until a boat made it part of a pattern. A coastline that looked broken and rough from a distance could become a chain of stopping places to someone who knew where to land. This is one of the quiet foundations of the Viking rise. Before they became masters of open water, they became masters of local water. A child growing up near the shore would not learn the sea from books. He would learn it by repetition, watching adults pull a boat above the tide, hearing wood scrape over stones, smelling tar, salt, wet rope, fish, and cold air, feeling the weight of an oar, learning when to step carefully, where to sit, how to balance, and when to listen to older voices. The sea entered the body before it entered legend. A person learned the rhythm of rowing, the ache in the shoulders, the sting of cold spray on the face, the sudden fear when a wave struck from the wrong angle, the relief of seeing a familiar shore appear through mist. These were not grand events to be remembered in sagas. They were the small lessons that made greater voyages possible, and every small crossing taught trust. Trust in the boat, trust in the crew, trust in the one who reads the weather, trust that the shore beyond the grey water is still there, even when fog hides it. Without that trust, the horizon remains a wall. With it, the horizon becomes a doorway. The early northern boat was part of daily life. It connected the farm to the fishing ground, the village to the market, the household to relatives beyond a stretch of water. It allowed people to move through a landscape where land itself could be difficult. Mountains, forests, marshes, rocky ground, snow, and long distances around water that a boat could cross directly. In this way, the boat made the north smaller, and later it would make the world larger. That is how progress often works. A tool made for ordinary survival becomes the foundation of extraordinary expansion. A boat that carries fish today may carry trade goods tomorrow. A route used to visit kin may become a route to a market. A crossing learned in childhood may become the first step toward open sea. At first, movement is local, then regional, then distant. The water teaches patience before it teaches ambition. Imagine a small crew before sunrise. The boat is pulled from the shore. The hull is cold beneath their hands. The air smells of seaweed and wet wood. Someone checks the rope. Someone looks toward the sky. The water is dark, but not unknown. They have crossed this way before. They know where the current turns. They know which rocks to avoid. They know where the wind can become troublesome between two cliffs. They push. The boat slides into the water. For a moment, land and sea meet under their feet. Then the boat floats free, and the shore begins to move away. This small departure contains the shape of a much larger future, because every time people leave a shore and return, they change their sense of what is possible. The first crossings may be cautious and close, but return gives confidence. Confidence allows distance. Distance brings contact. Contact brings goods, stories, comparisons, envy, ambition, and desire. People who move begin to know what others have, and knowing what others have can make staying small more difficult. The early northern world was full of these quiet connections. Goods could move, news could move, marriages could connect families across water, feuds could travel too. A person might hear of a better market, a richer leader, a place where silver was easier to find, a coast where defenses were weak, or a river that led inland toward wealth. The sea did not only move bodies, it moved information, and information is one of the first forms of power. A community that knows only its own valley remains limited by its own valley. A community that knows the coast, the islands, the crossings, the seasons, and the habits of other shores begins to live in a larger mental world. It begins to compare. It begins to plan. It begins to imagine journeys not as impossible acts, but as extensions of things already known. This is why the first wooden roads mattered. They trained the North to think in routes. A trip happens once. A route can be repeated. It can be taught, improved, remembered, and extended. It can gather warnings, landing places, trading partners, dangers, and expectations. Once a route exists in memory, it becomes easier for the next person to follow. And once many routes exist, a network begins. The Viking world would later spread through networks of water, across the North Sea, around the British Isles, into the Irish Sea, across the North Atlantic, down rivers, through trading towns and along coasts where ships could appear suddenly and leave before land-based forces could respond. But before those larger networks existed, the habit of route making had to begin somewhere. It began with familiar water, with short crossings, with wooden hulls moving through cold waves, with people learning that water did not only divide places, it connected them. There is a quiet psychological change in that discovery. A land path feels fixed. It lies under the feet. It can be seen and followed. A sea path exists only when people remember it and dare to travel it. It is remade every time a boat crosses. This means the road belongs partly to the mind. A sailor carries the road inside him. He carries the memory of winds, currents, birds, coastlines, storms, and safe landings. He carries advice from older sailors. He carries mistakes made by others. He carries the shape of the journey before the journey begins. That kind of memory is portable power. It does not need a stone road. It needs people who know how to leave and return. And in the north, more and more people learned exactly that. Not all at once, not as an empire, not under one command, but through thousands of practical movements across water. A boat here, a crossing there, a fishing route, a trading visit, a family journey, a dangerous return, a story told beside the fire. Slowly the wooden roads became familiar enough to trust, and once they were trusted, they could be extended. This is the bridge between survival and expansion. The sea that once only fed the household now connected the household to wealth. The boat that once only crossed a fjord could be strengthened, enlarged, and trusted farther from shore. The knowledge that once kept fishermen alive could help travelers reach unknown coasts. The future sea kings were not born from a single invention or a single raid. They were born from a long apprenticeship to water. Before they could shock distant shores, they had to learn nearby ones. Before they could cross the North Sea, they had to cross the fjord. Before they could become feared, they had to become skilled. And skill, in the north, began with ordinary people moving carefully over dark water because daily life required it. But these first wooden roads were only the beginning. A local boat could connect a village to another village. A better boat could connect a region. A greater ship could connect worlds. And when northern builders learned to make ships that were fast, flexible, strong, and able to move through both sea and river, the small world of the Longhouse would open wider than ever before. A boat can cross water. A ship can change the size of the world. For the people of the cold north, that difference mattered more than almost anything else. Small boats had already taught them the fjords, bays, islands, short crossings, fishing grounds, and familiar coastlines where rocks waited beneath the surface and weather could turn quickly. But the rise from poor northern settlements to sea kings required something greater. They needed vessels that could carry more than fish. They needed ships that could carry people, goods, weapons, ambition, stories, and fear across distances that once seemed too wide for ordinary life. The Viking ship did not appear from nowhere. It grew out of a long relationship with wood, water, weather, and need. It came from generations of builders who understood trees, planks, iron, rope, tar, wool, wind, and the difficult behavior of the sea. Before a ship could carry men to distant shores, someone had to choose the right timber. Someone had to split it, shape it, bend it, fasten it, and trust it. Someone had to know how wood behaves when wet, where it is strong, where it is weak, and how it can be joined without becoming too heavy. A good ship could not be only strong, it had to be alive in the water. Too heavy, and it became slow. Too weak, and it broke. Too deep, and it could not move through shallow rivers or land close to shore. Too small, and it could not carry enough people or goods to change a family's future. The ship had to find a balance. That balance became one of the great secrets of the Viking rise. The best-known Viking ships were light, flexible, fast, and suited to a world of coasts, rivers, islands, and sudden movement. They could cross rough seas, but they could also approach shallow beaches. They could move under sail when the wind was useful, and under oars when the wind failed or silence mattered. They could appear where heavier vessels might struggle. They could leave quickly. They could travel not only across open water, but into the veins of the land. This changed the meaning of distance. A poor settlement by the shore was no longer trapped by its own fields. A crew with a good ship could reach places where wealth gathered. A leader with ships could gather followers. Traders could carry goods farther. Raiders could strike quickly and vanish. Settlers could cross toward islands and new coasts. The ship gave the northern world movement at a scale it had never had before. In this story, the ship is not just a tool, it is the bridge between survival and power. Imagine a ship being built near the water. The air smells of resin, wet earth, wood shavings, and smoke. The hull is taking shape slowly, plank by plank. People move around it with quiet concentration. A builder runs his hand along a curve of timber, feeling whether it is right. Someone carries iron rivets. Someone heats tar. Someone works rope through tired hands. The frame rests close to the shore because the ship belongs to the water even before it touches it. This is not a palace, this is not a monument, and yet it may be more important than either. A palace holds power in one place. A ship gives power movement. That was the transformation. The Longhouse had taught endurance. The coast had taught water. Local boats had taught route making, but the larger ship allowed those lessons to travel farther. The skills of the household, the patience of winter, the memory of coasts, the ambition of young men, the authority of leaders, and the hunger for silver could now be gathered into one vessel and sent beyond the horizon. The ship turned many separate pressures into one direction, outward. Before the great voyagers, the world of a northern farmer or fisherman might still be mostly local. The valley, the fjord, the neighboring settlement, the trading place within reach, the kinship ties that shape daily life. But a ship widened that world. It allowed people to think in terms of distant shores, foreign markets, river towns, island settlements, and lands where new homes might be carved out of uncertainty. The ship made imagination practical. A dream of wealth is only a dream if there is no way to reach it. A rumor of silver is only a rumor if the sea cannot be crossed. A distant coast is only a story until a ship makes it possible to stand there. And once a few ships returned with goods, stories, metal, captives, or silver, the meaning of the ship changed for everyone watching from home. It was no longer only wood. It was a promise, not a safe promise, not a gentle one, but a promise that the small world of the north did not have to remain small. Think of the moment a ship leaves shore. The crew pushes it into cold water, oars are lifted into place, the sail is still tied, the hull rocks as men climb aboard. Families may stand near the landing place, watching. Some hope for wealth, some fear the sea, some know the ship may return with silver, some know it may not return at all. The oars dip, the shore loosens its hold, the ship turns toward open water. This moment happened countless times before history noticed it. A small crew leaving for trade, a group sailing to visit another coast, a leader testing his men, a voyage that returned with proof that farther travel was possible. Over time, departures built confidence, confidence built ambition, ambition built wider networks, and networks built the Viking world. The ship also changed leadership. In a land where wealth and good soil were limited, a leader who could provide opportunity became powerful. A ship required resources, skill, cooperation, and trust. It needed builders, crew, provisions, weapons, knowledge of routes, and a reason to go. A person who could organize all of that was already more than an ordinary farmer. He could gather men, he could promise reward, he could lead movement, and movement was becoming power. A leader who returned with wealth could give gifts. Gifts created loyalty. Loyalty created followers. Followers made larger voyages possible. Larger voyages brought more wealth. Wealth built status. Status built authority. And authority could begin to look like kingship. In that way, the ship did not only carry people across the sea, it carried social change. The difference between a man with a farm and a man with a ship could become the difference between local respect and wider reputation, between surviving inside the limits of home and shaping the lives of others beyond it. This is where the rise begins to accelerate. The ship allowed the North to reach places where wealth was more concentrated than at home. Monasteries, trading towns, river settlements, coastal communities, and foreign courts held goods that poor northern farms did not. Silver, textiles, weapons, ornaments, coins, and captives could all become part of the growing economy of movement. But the ship was not only useful for raiding. That is too narrow. It was also a trading vessel, a messenger, a carrier of settlers, a connector of families, a symbol of status, and sometimes an object so important that it carried the dead into memory. It stood at the center of the northern imagination because it did what the land could not do. It opened the world. A person who returned from across the sea did not return only with objects. He returned with knowledge. He had seen foreign coasts. He knew where rivers entered the land, where wealth gathered, where defenses were weak, where a landing was possible, where the voyage might be repeated. A voyage becomes a story becomes advice becomes a route becomes a system, and a system becomes power. The Viking ship made that cycle possible. It gave memory a hull. There is also something deeply symbolic about the ship in a northern world. The Longhouse was rooted. It held family, winter, animals, fire, and memory. The ship was movement, risk, distance, leaving, returning. It was a wooden space where people lived together under sky and weather, sharing labor, hunger, danger, and hope. In a sense, the ship became a floating longhouse, not comfortable, not safe, but organized. Like the longhouse, it required cooperation. Like the farm, it required preparation. Like winter, it punished carelessness. But unlike the farm, it could cross into the unknown. That made it transformative. The cold north had created people who could endure hardship. The ship gave endurance direction. Now the horizon was no longer only something to look at from the shore. It was something to enter. The sea was no longer only a danger beside the village. It was a surface that could carry ambition. This is the chapter where the Viking rise becomes visible. Not fully yet, not as kingdoms, not as sea kings, not as settlements across half the known world, but as possibility made from wood. The land had pushed them, the sea had trained them, the ship gave them reach, and once a people has reach, everything changes. A small northern settlement can touch a foreign coast. A poor farm can hear of wealth and imagine taking part in it. A young man with no land can become part of a crew. A local leader can become a name beyond his valley. A route can become regular. A voyage can become expected. A shore that once seemed distant can become familiar. This is how the world begins to open, one ship at a time. But every new power carries a question. If ships can carry trade, they can also carry violence. If they can reach markets, they can also reach undefended wealth. If they can return with goods from exchange, they can return with goods taken by force. The same vessel that made the northern world larger also made it more dangerous. And soon, some of the people who had learned the sea as a road would use that road to arrive suddenly, strike quickly, and leave before the world understood what had happened. The farmer, the sailor, the trader, and the raider were beginning to meet in the same ship. A ship can carry trade. It can carry wool, fish, timber, amber, iron, stories, and news from one coast to another. But the same ship can also carry something darker: hunger, ambition, young men with little land, leaders looking for followers, crews willing to risk the sea for wealth. The northern soil could not easily give. This is where the story becomes more dangerous, not because the people of the north suddenly became something entirely new, but because the pressures of their world began to gather inside the same wooden hull. Hard land, long winters, skilled shipbuilding, local sailing, the hunger for silver, the desire for reputation, and the knowledge of routes across water all began to point in the same direction, outward. And once they did, some farmers became raiders. This does not mean they stopped being farmers. That is important. A man might plant, harvest, repair fences, care for animals, and still leave with a crew when the season allowed. The same hands that held an oar could later hold a sickle. The same person who returned with silver might go back to his farm, his family, his animals, and the ordinary work of surviving another winter. The Viking world was not divided as cleanly as legend makes it seem. There were not simply peaceful farmers on one side and professional raiders on the other. There were people living in a hard world, using the sea in different ways, sometimes to fish, sometimes to trade, sometimes to settle, and sometimes to strike. To understand how this happened, return to the limits of home. Imagine a young man in a northern settlement. He has grown up in the Longhouse, learned the cold, watched the shore, helped with animals, carried wood, repaired tools, and listened to stories beside the fire. He knows the land around him. He knows its paths, its fields, its stones, and its limits. But he may also know there is not enough for everyone. Perhaps the best land belongs to older relatives. Perhaps inheritance will leave him with little. Perhaps a local leader is gathering men for a voyage. Perhaps someone has returned with silver, a fine weapon, a foreign object, or simply a story that makes the world beyond the sea feel close enough to touch. The young man looks toward the shore. The boat is there. The sea is dangerous, but staying small has its own danger. This is one of the engines behind the Viking rise. It was not only greed, it was not only violence, it was the pressure of limited opportunity, meeting the possibility of movement. A farm could hold a person in place, a ship could offer another future. For some, raiding became a way to gain wealth quickly, in a world where wealth was otherwise slow to build. Land grows grain only through seasons of labor. Animals multiply slowly. Trade requires goods to offer. But across the sea, there were places where wealth had already gathered. Monasteries, trading centers, coastal settlements, river towns, and estates connected to richer worlds. From the northern shore, that wealth could seem almost unreal. Silver in foreign buildings, fine cloth, coins, ornaments, tools, objects that could be carried home and transformed into status. A successful raid did not only bring goods, it brought reputation. It proved courage, luck, skill, and leadership. It could help a leader give gifts. It could turn a young man from one more body in a crowded household into someone with a name worth remembering. In a society where honor and reputation mattered, that was powerful. But raiding required more than desire. It required knowledge. A crew had to know when to sail, where to land, how to move quickly, and how to return. They had to understand which winds helped, which tides trapped, which coasts were dangerous, which rivers led inland, and which places had wealth but little defense. This is why the earlier steps matter. The raid was not the beginning of the Viking world. It was one result of it. Without the Longhouse, there is no disciplined crew. Without the hard land, there is less pressure to leave. Without the local boats, there is no apprenticeship to water. Without the larger ship, there is no reach. The raider grows out of the farmer, the fisher, the trader, and the boat builder. The same world produces them all. Imagine a crew preparing before sunrise. The air is cold. The ship waits near the shore. Men move quietly, not as a wild crowd, but as people who know order matters. Oars must be ready, food must be carried, weapons must be placed where they can be reached. The sail must be checked. The leader must know the route, or trust someone who does. There may be excitement, there may be fear, there may be jokes, silence, boasts, and private thoughts no one says aloud. Behind them, the longhouses remain. Families watch. Some hope for wealth. Some fear the sea. Some know the ship may return with silver. Some know it may not return at all. Then the hull meets the water. The oars dip. The shore begins to move away. At that moment, the crew has not yet become legend. They are still people leaving home with cold hands, hungry ambitions, and uncertain futures. But the direction of their lives has changed. They are no longer only working within the limits of the land. They are using the ship to reach beyond those limits. This is the dangerous power of the Viking ship. It made distance shorter. It made surprise possible. It made wealth reachable. A raid depended on speed and timing. A ship could approach a coast, land quickly, and leave before a slower land force could respond. A river could become a doorway into the interior. A beach could become an entrance. A quiet morning on one shore could become a moment of fear, because another shore had learned how to move. For the people being attacked, this felt like terror from the sea. For the people in the ship, it was the use of everything they had learned at home: coordination, timing, endurance, courage, and trust in the vessel. We should not romanticize it. Raiding caused fear, loss, and suffering. It was violent. It took from people who often could not defend themselves. For those on the receiving end, the arrival of northern ships could be devastating. But to understand the rise, we have to see the transformation clearly. For the victims, the ship was a nightmare on the horizon. For the northern crew, it was a way out of limits. Both truths belong to the story. The wealth that returned north did not come from nowhere. It came through trade, gifts, service, settlement, and sometimes through force. The Viking rise was not clean or gentle. It was shaped by danger because the world that produced it was dangerous too. But raiding was only one part of a larger pattern. The same routes that allowed attacks also allowed trade. The same crews that struck one year might exchange goods another year. The same sea that carried fear also carried negotiation, migration, marriage, and settlement. The line between trader and raider could be thin. Sometimes it depended on opportunity, sometimes on resistance, sometimes on leadership, sometimes on whether the people on shore were willing or able to bargain. This flexibility made the Vikings difficult for other societies to understand. They could arrive as merchants, mercenaries, settlers, or attackers. They could take silver by agreement, by service, by exchange, or by force. They could leave quickly or return again and again, until temporary movement became lasting presence. That flexibility was part of their power. A rigid people can be predicted. A flexible people can adapt. And the northern world had already taught adaptation for generations. When the first raiding voyages succeeded, they changed expectations at home. A voyage that returned with wealth became proof. It showed that the sea could do more than feed a household or connect neighboring coasts. It could change status. It could pull silver from distant places into northern halls. It could reward risk, and proof is dangerous, because once one crew returns with wealth, another crew imagines doing the same. A story becomes a plan becomes a voyage becomes a pattern becomes an age. The Longhouse world had found a way to reach beyond itself, but that way was not only peaceful. The North had learned to move. Now it was learning that movement could make it feared. This was a major step in the impossible rise. The farmers of cold settlements were not yet sea kings. They did not yet rule great territories, found distant colonies, or become woven into the politics of kingdoms far from home. But something had changed. They had discovered that ships could turn the weakness of distance into strength. They could arrive where they were not expected. They could choose the moment. They could leave before the land caught them. The sea, once an edge, had become a weapon. And yet the deeper story is not only about violence, it is about transformation. A poor northern world was learning to convert skill into reach into wealth, wealth into reputation, and reputation into power. That is the path from farmer to raider, but a raider who returns once is only a raider. A crew that returns again begins to create a route. A route used again and again becomes a system. And once raids became repeated, remembered, and expected, distant communities would begin to feel the shape of a new northern force. The next step was shock. The moment when people on other shores looked toward the water and realized that the sea itself had changed. For generations, the sea had been a familiar road to the people of the north. It carried fishermen to cold waters. It carried traders between settlements. It carried families across fjords, news between hauls, and stories from one coast to another. To those who knew it, the sea was dangerous but readable, harsh but useful, a road of wind, current, memory, and wood. But to people waiting on other shores, that same sea was beginning to change. It was no longer only a distance, it was becoming a doorway. Imagine a quiet coast far from Scandinavia. Morning comes softly, the water is grey, a religious community wakes near the shore. The day begins with prayer, work, bells, animals, books, bread, and the ordinary rhythm of a place that does not expect the horizon to become dangerous. The sea is there, but it feels like background. It brings weather, it brings fish, sometimes it brings travelers. Then someone sees shapes on the water. At first they may not seem like much. Low hulls, dark lines, oars moving in a slow pattern, a sail against the pale morning, ships where no ships were expected. The watchers may not understand what they are seeing. They may think of merchants, strangers, messengers, or travelers needing shelter, but the ships keep coming, low, fast, purposeful, and in that moment the old meaning of the sea begins to break. This was how the Viking world first became truly visible to many people beyond the north, not through explanation, but through shock. The sailors did not arrive with a history of cold farms, short summers, hard land, local boats, and generations of skill. They did not explain that the sea had trained them, that poverty had pushed them, that ships had widened their world. To the people on the shore, they arrived like weather, like a storm with oars. The famous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 is often remembered as one of the great shocks near the beginning of the Viking Age in the British Isles. It was not the first movement of northern people across water, and it was not the whole story of the Viking world, but it became a symbol of something larger. A sacred place exposed by the sea could be reached. A wealthy place, trusted by habit, could be struck. A distant shore was no longer distant enough. That was the deeper shock. For communities along coasts and rivers, the fear was not only that one place had suffered, it was that the map had changed. The sea, which once seemed like protection through distance, had become a route for sudden arrival. Isolation could no longer be trusted. A monastery on an island or remote coast might feel far from armies, roads, and political violence, but it was not far from a ship. Northern sailors did not need the roads of the land. They brought their own road with them. A land army usually leaves signs. It needs paths, supplies, bridges, time. It moves through villages, fields, and known routes. But ships can come from the open water. They can appear where no road leads. They can land, move quickly, and leave before slower defenses understand what has happened. This was not only a new kind of violence, it was a new kind of mobility. And mobility can frighten settled worlds more than size. The early Viking crews were not vast empires. They were often small compared to the kingdoms and church lands they would trouble. But they had speed, they had surprise, they had ships suited to shallow shores and river mouths, they had crews used to working together, they had the confidence to leave one coast and trust themselves to reach another. A small force arriving unexpectedly can feel larger than it is. Fear does part of the work. After the first shock, stories traveled faster than ships. A raid on one coast became a warning on another. Monks, rulers, traders, and villagers began to imagine northern sails before they saw them. A ship on the horizon was no longer only a ship. It became a question. Who are they? What do they want? Can they reach us too? This is how fear expands geography. One shore is struck, and many shores begin to feel closer to danger. For the northern crews, these early shocks created knowledge. They learned which places were wealthy, which were exposed, which rivers opened inland, which beaches allowed landing, which seasons favored movement, and where resistance was weak or slow. Every voyage, even a dangerous one, returned with more than silver if it returned at all. It returned with information. Information became memory. Memory became repetition. Repetition became route. and root became power. This is why the shock across the sea matters so much in the Viking rise. It was the moment when the hard world of the north forced richer and more settled lands to notice it. A small, restless, ship-borne society at the edge of Europe began to enter the thoughts of kings, monks, merchants, and coastal communities far from the fjords. A poor northern world was no longer only reacting to pressure, it was creating pressure. That is a major transformation. A settlement with little land cannot make a distant king think about it, but ships arriving without warning can. A farm at the edge of the north cannot change how a monastery stores its treasure, but a raid from the sea can. A scattered group of sailors cannot control a kingdom, but repeated attacks can make a kingdom plan, defend, pay, negotiate, and remember. When other people begin to organize their lives around your possible arrival, your influence has already grown beyond your own shore. Still, this was not the whole Viking world. It would be too simple to say they were only attackers. The same sea that carried fear also carried trade. The same routes that brought raids could later bring bargaining, payment, service, settlement, or exchange. A northern crew might arrive as a threat in one season and as merchants in another. Some groups took wealth by force, others carried goods, served foreign rulers, or built new homes far from Scandinavia. But the early shocks gave the Viking name its shadow. They made the northern ship unforgettable. For those watching from shore, the Viking ship was a sign that safety had become uncertain. For those sailing it, the ship was proof that the wider world could be reached. The same vessel could be terror to one coast and hope to another. History often depends on which shore you stand on. Imagine again the quiet community near the sea after news of a raid has reached it. The buildings are the same, the water is the same, the prayers are the same, but the feeling has changed. A person walking near the shore looks longer at distant shapes. A sound on the water carries more meaning. The horizon, once empty, now seems to hold possibility and threat at the same time. That is how a reputation begins, not only in the event itself, but in the waiting after it. The Vikings became powerful partly because people began to expect them. Fear traveled ahead of the ships. Stories prepared the mind before sails appeared. A northern crew did not need to be present everywhere to be imagined everywhere along vulnerable coasts. And imagination can be a battlefield of its own. For the North, this reputation brought opportunity. A feared name could lead to payment. A repeated threat could lead to negotiation. A dangerous crew could become useful to a ruler who wanted them turned against someone else. Fear could become tribute, service, settlement, or political leverage. The first shock did not end the story. It opened a new relationship between the North and the wider world, a relationship built from fear, wealth, movement, and adaptation. By now, the rise had entered a new stage. The Longhouse had produced people who could endure. The land had pushed them outward. The sea had trained them. The ship had given them reach. Raiding had shown that reach could become force. And now, the world beyond Scandinavia had begun to respond. That response would feed the rise even further, because once northern ships were feared, paid, resisted, hired, and remembered, the Vikings were no longer only travelers from a hard land. They had become part of the decisions of other societies. The sea itself had changed in the minds of those who lived beside it. What had once been distance had become danger. What had once been horizon had become warning. And from that warning, another hunger grew in the north, because shock could bring wealth. But wealth, once tasted, rarely asks people to stop. It asks for more. Fear opened the first door, but silver kept it open. Once northern crews learned that ships could cross the sea, strike quickly, trade widely, and return with wealth, the world beyond Scandinavia changed in their imagination. It was no longer only a dangerous distance or a rumor told beside the fire. It became opportunity, a place where wealth had already gathered, a place where a ship could leave almost empty and return heavy. This is where the Viking rise becomes larger than raiding, because the Vikings were not only warriors appearing suddenly on foreign shores, they were also traders, settlers, craftsmen, negotiators, travelers, and middlemen between worlds that did not always know each other well. Their ships carried fear, but they also carried goods: furs, amber, iron, honey, wax, weapons, cloth, walrus, ivory, and silver. They carried people looking for land, status, work, service, and a future. The sea did not only make violence possible, it made exchange possible. And exchange can build power just as surely as conquest. Imagine a northern ship returning after a long journey. It moves slowly toward the shore, lower in the water than when it left. People gather near the landing place. They see bundles, chests, foreign objects, perhaps coins marked with writing few at home can read. They see fine cloth, metal, ornaments, beads, tools, and pieces of silver that can be cut, weighed, worn, gifted, buried, or traded. The ship has brought back more than goods. It has brought proof that the world is wider, proof that the sea can answer the hunger of the land, proof that a person with skill, courage, and the right companions can return with something that changes his place at home. In the Viking world, silver mattered deeply. It was wealth a person could carry, wealth that could be divided, wealth that could become jewelry, payment, treasure, gift, or memory. Coins from far away could enter northern life not only as money, but as metal, as status, and as visible evidence that someone had touched distant worlds. Silver turned movement into reputation. A voyage that returned with nothing might fade into warning. A voyage that returned with silver became a story worth repeating, and stories build ambition. A young man who saw silver on another man's arm could imagine where it came from. A leader who gave silver generously could gather loyalty. A household that gained foreign wealth could rise in local standing. A settlement tied to trade routes could become more important than its fields alone would suggest. The hunger for silver was not only greed, it was fuel for social change. In a hard northern world, where land could be limited and wealth slow to accumulate, movable wealth was powerful. It allowed status to travel. It allowed leaders to reward followers. It allowed families to measure success, not only by fields and animals, but by what had been brought from beyond the horizon. This is how the Viking world began to stretch. Westward, ships moved toward the British Isles, Ireland, the Frankish coast, islands, monasteries, markets, and river mouths. Eastward, northern travelers moved along rivers and trade routes that connected the Baltic world to Slavic lands, steppe routes, the Black Sea, Byzantium, and the wealth of the Islamic world. The Viking rise did not move in one direction. It spread like water through every channel it could find. Coasts, rivers, islands, trading towns, portages, winter camps, settlements, markets. A raider might see a coast as a target. A trader might see it as an opportunity. A settler might see it as a future home. A leader might see it as a base. The same ship, the same route, and sometimes even the same people could shift between these roles depending on season, strength, resistance, and reward. That flexibility made them powerful. They were not trapped inside one method. If trade was possible, they could trade. If service was profitable, they could serve. If land could be taken or granted, they could settle. If a place was weak and rich, some would raid. And through all of this, wealth flowed north. But wealth did not remain still. A leader with silver could hold feasts. He could give rings, weapons, ornaments, and gifts. He could attract men who wanted reward. He could become known as generous, and generosity was not simply kindness. It was political power. A leader who gives creates obligation. A man who receives may owe loyalty. A hall filled with gifts becomes a center of reputation. So the silver brought home from distant places did not stay silent. It spoke. It said, "This leader can reward you." It said this voyage was worth the risk. It said the sea is dangerous, but the sea brings power. It said there is more beyond the farm. In that way, trade and raiding both fed the same growing system. Wealth supported followers. Followers supported voyagers. Voyagers brought more wealth. More wealth created stronger leaders. Stronger leaders could organize larger expeditions, better ships, wider routes, and more lasting influence. The rise accelerated. What began as survival at the edge of cold land was becoming a cycle of movement and reward. And once a cycle like that begins, it is hard to stop. Picture a winter hall after successful voyages. The fire is low. Outside the weather is bitter. Inside people sit close, listening. One man holds a piece of foreign silver. Another wears a ring, gained from a journey west. Someone speaks of a river route in the east. Someone else describes a town where merchants gather. A younger listener hears these stories and begins to understand that the farm is not the only measure of life. The world beyond the sea becomes more real with every object brought home. A coin is not only metal, it is a map in the hand. A bead is not only decoration, it is evidence of distance. A foreign sword, a fine cloth, a piece of ivory, a weight of silver. Each object tells the same quiet message. There are worlds beyond this one, and we can reach them. This is one of the great emotional shifts in the Viking rise. The early North had been shaped by limits: land, winter, inheritance, food, local power. But trade and silver made those limits feel less final. A person could leave, return, and alter his place in the community. A settlement could connect itself to roots larger than its own fields. A leader could build authority not only from land, but from movement. The North was no longer only receiving pressure, it was sending movement outward and pulling wealth back in. And the more it did this, the more the Viking world became part of a larger system. Northern crews were no longer isolated people at the edge of Europe. They were connectors of distant markets, feared by some, welcomed by others, hired by rulers, resisted by kings, and remembered by monks. This is the stage where the simple image of the Viking as only a raider becomes too small. A raider takes, a trader connects, a settler roots, a mercenary serves, a leader organizes. The Viking world contained all of these at once. That complexity is part of why their rise was so powerful. They could move between worlds because their ships allowed them to. They could adapt because their home had already taught adaptation. They could cross the boundary between violence and exchange, between sea and river, between local ambition and distant politics. Silver was one bright thread running through it. Not the only thread, but a strong one. It pulled men toward the sea. It rewarded risk. It turned voyages into status. It made distant places matter in northern halls. It helped transform scattered local power into wider networks of loyalty and influence. And yet silver was never enough by itself. A single raid could bring wealth. A single trading voyage could bring profit. But the true rise required repetition. The same coasts visited again. The same rivers learned. The same markets reached. The same routes passed from one crew to another. The same stories becoming instructions. Wealth created hunger for more. Hunger created movement. Movement created roots. And roots would soon become the skeleton of a Viking world that stretched far beyond the cold homes where it began. Because when a path is taken once, it is a risk. When it is taken again, it is a memory. When it is taken often enough, it becomes a system. And the next great step in the Viking rise was exactly that. Scattered voyages turning into routes that connected the north to the wider world. A single voyage can change a life. A repeated voyage can change a world. This is the point where the Viking rise becomes larger than individual raids, individual ships, and individual crews returning home with silver. At first, a journey across the sea may have felt uncertain, almost impossible. A shore beyond the horizon was only a rumor until someone reached it. A river mouth was only part of someone else's story until a crew found it for themselves. But once a path had been taken, it could be remembered, and once it was remembered, it could be taken again. This is how scattered movement became routes. A crew returning from a distant coast did not bring back only metal, cloth, captives, or stories of danger. They brought back knowledge, where the sea was rough, where the wind helped, where fresh water could be found, where a beach allowed landing, where a monastery stood close to shore, where a trading place gathered wealth, where a river could carry a ship inland, where resistance was slow, where the risk was too high. That knowledge mattered as much as silver. Silver could be spent, knowledge could be repeated, and repeated knowledge becomes power. Imagine a winter evening in the north. Outside, wind moves over frozen ground. Inside the hall, men who have sailed sit near the fire. Younger listeners gather close, not only for warmth, but for information. One man describes a coast in the west. Another remembers a river in the east. Someone names an island where ships can shelter. Someone warns of a tide that must be watched carefully. It may sound like storytelling, but inside the story is a map. Not a map drawn on parchment, a map carried in memory. A route begins this way, with words, with warnings, with the shape of a coastline described by someone who has survived it. The first time a ship sails a dangerous crossing, it is an act of courage. The second time, it is courage supported by memory. The third time, it begins to feel less like a miracle and more like a possibility. By the 10th time, the sea has changed. It has places, names, dangers, shelters, and expectations. The Viking world grew through that change. Raids became repeated. Trading journeys became repeated. Seasonal movements became repeated. Crews began to know where to go, when to leave, what to carry, what to expect, and what might be gained. This is the difference between adventure and system. An adventure belongs to one group. A system can outlive them. Once routes formed, the northern world became more organized. Leaders could plan with greater confidence. Crews could be gathered with clearer promises. Traders could carry goods toward places where exchange was possible. Raiders could return to coasts where past success had taught them something. Settlers could follow paths, first opened by sailors, merchants, and raiders before them. The sea was no longer only open space, it was becoming a network, and a network is one of the deepest forms of power. A network connects small places to larger worlds. It allows a poor farm in the north to touch a market far away. It allows a local leader to hear of wealth beyond his valley. It allows news to travel, silver to move, reputations to grow, and ambitions to spread from one hall to another. The Vikings did not rise only because they had ships. They rose because they turned ships into repeated movement, movement into routes, routes into influence. Think of the North Sea not as a barrier, but as a dark road crossed again and again. Think of the Irish Sea not only as water, but as a space where ships could move between coasts, islands, monasteries, settlements, and trading places. Think of the rivers of Eastern Europe not only as rivers, but as long corridors pulling northern travelers toward distant markets and empires. Each route changed the people who used it. A sailor who had crossed once was valuable. A sailor who knew the way was more valuable. A leader who controlled a ship was important. A leader who could organize many ships along known routes became far more powerful. This is how the rise began to leave the small scale of the farm and the single crew. The Viking world started to build patterns larger than any one household. A voyage was no longer only a chance to return with wealth. It became part of a wider rhythm of movement between north and south, east and west, home and distance. And every rhythm creates expectation. People at home began to expect that ships might leave in certain seasons. People abroad began to expect that northern ships might return. Some communities feared them, some traded with them, some paid them, some hired them, some fought them, but almost everyone touched by these routes had to respond to them. That response made the Viking world stronger. because when others respond to your movement, you have begun to shape their world. A coastal ruler might build defenses, a monastery might move treasure, a town might negotiate, a king might pay silver to make ships leave. Another ruler might hire northern warriors to fight someone else. A trading place might grow because ships from many directions gathered there. In each case, the route became more than a path. It became a relationship. This is another step in the transformation from raiders to sea kings. Power does not only come from taking wealth, it comes from becoming part of the decisions other people must make. When rulers, towns, monasteries, and merchants begin to plan around your arrival, your influence has already spread beyond your ships. The northern world was entering the minds of others. That may sound quiet, but it is enormous. A poor farm cannot force a king to think about it, but a fleet using a known route can. A small settlement cannot reshape a coastline, but repeated arrivals can. At first, a route is invisible. Only the sailors know it. Then it becomes a habit. Then it becomes a fear. Then a trade connection. Then a settlement path. Then a political fact. This is how water becomes history. The Vikings learned that a ship did not always have to return home immediately for a voyage to matter. A crew might winter somewhere. A trading group might stay longer than expected. A camp might become a base might become a settlement, and a settlement could become a town. The route begins as movement, then it creates places. This is why the next stage of the Viking rise was so important. They were no longer only coming and going. In some places they began to remain. But remaining was possible because routes had already taught them how to arrive, how to return, how to bring more people, and how to keep contact with the wider northern world. The ship opened the road. The route made the road reliable. Reliability made settlement possible. And settlement would soon make the Viking world deeper than raiding alone. There is something almost calm in the idea of a route, even when the route carries danger. A route means repetition, memory, and knowledge. It means the sea has been crossed enough times to become familiar. It means a person can stand on a northern shore and imagine not only the unknown, but a series of steps beyond it. That island, that current, that coast, that river, that market, that winter camp, that place where men returned with silver. The world becomes larger, but also more connected. For sleep, you can imagine these routes as lines of dark water beneath the northern sky. One line west toward islands and monasteries, one line south toward wealthy coasts, one line east through rivers and forests, one line north and west across the Atlantic, where islands waded in cold mist. Each line begins in the same kind of place: a shore, a ship, a crew, a memory of someone who went before, and each line leads farther from the Longhouse, farther from the small farm, farther from the limited land that first pushed people toward the water. By now, the Vikings were becoming more than people who could leave. They were becoming people who could connect. That is a greater power. A raider can frighten a shore for a day. A route can bind that shore to the north for generations. The rise from frozen homes to sea kings depended on this change. The north had to move beyond single moments of shock. It had to build habits of return, exchange, pressure, and presence. It had to create paths that could carry wealth outward and inward, carry people toward new homes, carry stories back to winter halls, and carry ambition into the next generation. Roots gave the Viking world its shape. And once that shape existed, the next step was almost inevitable. If a ship can reach a distant shore once, it can return. If it can return often, people can learn the place. If people can learn the place, some will begin to stay. And when the sea people began to stay beyond the horizon, they stopped being only visitors, traders, or raiders. They became settlers. They began building new worlds far from the cold homes where the story began. A route is powerful because it can be followed again. At first, the northern ships came and went. A crew crossed the water, reached a coast, took goods, traded, served, explored, or searched for opportunity, and then returned home with stories and proof. The voyage ended when the ship came back to the familiar shore, but over time some voyages stopped ending that way. Some crews stayed longer, some camps lasted through winter, some trading places became familiar, some foreign shores began to feel less like the edge of the world and more like a second beginning. This was another great step in the Viking rise. The people of the north were no longer only reaching beyond home. In some places they were building new homes beyond the horizon. Settlement changes everything. A raid is a moment. A trade visit is an exchange. A voyage is a journey between two places. But a settlement is a claim on the future. It means people have decided that a distant land is no longer only something to visit, fear, or exploit. It is somewhere to sleep, plant, repair, marry, raise children, build halls, bury the dead, and remember names. To settle is to make distance ordinary. And the Vikings did this across a remarkable world. They reached islands in the North Atlantic, where cold wind moved over grass and seabirds cried above dark cliffs. They reached Ireland and helped shape towns like Dublin. They reached parts of England where raiding, war, trade, and settlement slowly became something more permanent. They moved through river systems in the east, where northern travelers connected with Slavic lands, markets, and the wealth of distant empires. They crossed to Iceland and later to Greenland carrying animals, tools, laws, stories, and the memory of the homes they had left behind. This does not mean every settlement was the same. Some began as military camps, some as trading centers, some as farms, some as ports, some as places where violence, exchange, and local politics became tangled together. But all of them showed the same transformation. The sea people were becoming builders of new worlds. Imagine a ship arriving at a shore that will not be left behind quickly. The crew pulls it onto land. They look at the ground, the water, the shelter, the distance to other people, the places where animals might graze, and the place where boats can land again. They are not thinking only about what can be taken today. They are thinking about what can be held tomorrow. This is a different kind of ambition. It is slower than raiding, heavier, more dangerous in another way, because staying requires more than courage. It requires food, law, labor, family, agreement, and the ability to live beside people who may not have invited you there. It requires the raider to become something else again. Farmer, trader, builder, neighbor, ruler, or enemy, depending on the place and the moment. The Viking world was flexible enough to do this. That flexibility was one of its greatest strengths. A ship could bring warriors, but it could also bring settlers. It could carry weapons, but also tools. It could bring men seeking silver, and later families, animals, goods, and the slower equipment of ordinary life. The same seafaring knowledge that made a sudden attack possible also made migration possible. And migration is one of the deepest forms of rise. It means a people has moved beyond reaching for wealth. They have begun to extend their world. In Iceland, settlement meant carrying northern life into a land where old boundaries had not yet been inherited by generations of local families. People had to establish households, create assemblies, divide land, remember laws, survive winters, and build a new society under a wide, cold sky. In Greenland, the challenge became even harsher. Distance, climate, isolation, and the difficult balance between old habits and a severe new environment. In the British Isles and Islands, settlement meant living inside worlds already filled with kingdoms, churches, languages, and local power. Northern arrivals had to fight, bargain, trade, marry, adapt, and sometimes become part of the societies they first disturbed. A place that began as a raiding target could become a town. A winter camp could become a base. A base could become a center of trade and rule. This is how the Viking rise became rooted, not only in ships moving over water, but in places where ships stopped. Dublin, York, Normandy, Iceland, Greenland, river towns and trading routes of the East. Each tells a different version of the same larger story. the small northern world was no longer small. It had stretched itself across seas, coasts, islands, rivers, and frontiers. The Longhouse had traveled, not always in the exact shape of timber walls and a smoky hearth, but as an idea, a way of organizing people, a memory of kinship, craft, law, honor, survival, and fire. Wherever northern settlers went, they carried parts of the world that had made them, their tools, their speech, their ship knowledge, their stories, their gods, and later, their changing faith, their habits of trade, their hunger for land, and their ability to adapt. But settlement also changed them. A Viking who stayed in Ireland did not remain exactly the same as one who returned to Norway. A northern family in Iceland lived under different pressures than a family in Denmark. A leader in Normandy had to learn the politics of Frankish land and power. Travelers in the east moved through worlds of rivers, markets, and empires unlike the fjords of home. The Vikings carried the north outward, but the wider world changed the north in return. This is one of the quiet truths of expansion. No people travels far and remains untouched. The rise to sea kings was not simply the north conquering distance, it was the north being transformed by distance. Every new settlement created new identities, new loyalties, new mixtures, and new futures. The sea did not only carry Vikings out, it carried other worlds back into them. That is why this stage matters so much. The first chapters of the rise were about survival, cold homes, hard land, local water, and the daily discipline of the Longhouse. Then came movement, ships, raids, trade, silver, and roots. Now comes presence. The Vikings are no longer only arriving, they are remaining, and once they remain, their power becomes harder to ignore. A raiding crew can leave, a trading ship can sail away, but a settlement changes the map. It creates a place where northern influence can last beyond one season, one leader, or one voyage. A shore with a Viking camp becomes a point of pressure. A town shaped by Viking trade becomes part of a network. A colony across the ocean becomes proof that the sea can be crossed not only for wealth, but for life. This is the rise becoming visible in the land itself. The horizon that once seemed like the edge of possibility has now become a line people can cross, settle beyond, and teach to their children as home. But settlement also raises a new question. If the Vikings could raid, trade, travel, and settle across such a wide world, how far could their influence go? The answer would be astonishing. From the cold farms of the north, their ships and settlements would stretch across a world of islands, kingdoms, rivers, and empires, and, at their height, the people who began in smoke-filled homes beside dark water would become one of the most far-reaching forces of the medieval sea. At its height, the Viking world was no longer only a story of ships leaving cold northern shores. It had become a web of routes, settlements, markets, armies, river paths, island colonies, sea roads, and leaders whose names could travel farther than their farms ever could. The rise had widened. The smoke of the Longhouse still mattered. The cold fields still mattered. The small farms, the hard winters, the practical households, the boat pulled above the tide. All of that remained the beginning. But by the time the Viking world reached its peak, those beginnings had been stretched across a map that would have seemed impossible to the first families waking beside the northern sea. Their ships moved west across the North Sea, around the British Isles, into Ireland, Scotland, England, and the islands of the North Atlantic. They crossed toward Iceland, and later Greenland. They moved south along wealthy coasts. They moved east through rivers, forests, portages, trading places, and distant markets. Some went as raiders, some as traders, some as settlers, some as warriors in the service of foreign rulers, some as explorers, some as families looking for land, safety, status, or a better future than the old farm could provide. This was the power of the Viking world at its greatest scale. Not one single empire, not one single crown, but a wide moving network of people who had learned to turn the sea into connection. That is what made them so remarkable. A kingdom controls territory, a fleet controls movement, and, for a time, the Vikings became masters of movement. They could appear on coasts, enter rivers, establish camps, build towns, trade in markets, take service in foreign courts, and settle lands so far from home that the old Longhouse world began to echo in places no ancestor had known. The world that once felt narrow had become astonishingly wide. Imagine standing on a northern shore and trying to picture the reach of that world. To the west, ships moved toward islands in the mist, toward Ireland, toward Iceland, toward Greenland, toward the cold Atlantic edge, where sea and sky become almost the same color. To the south, ships moved toward richer coasts, toward towns, kingdoms, monasteries, silver, tribute, resistance, and negotiation. To the east, travelers follow rivers inland, pulling ships where water breaks, passing through forests and settlements, moving toward the trade of faraway empires. The same northern skill appears in many forms: a hull on open water, an oar in a river, a market stall, a winter camp, a farm in a new land, a warrior standing in a foreign hall. This is no longer a people trapped by thin soil and cold seasons. This is a people whose movement has become influence. But their peak was not only measured by distance, it was also measured by transformation. In many places, the Vikings did not remain outsiders forever. They adapted, they married, they traded, they accepted new faiths, they learned local politics, they became rulers, neighbors, enemies, allies, and ancestors. The world changed them, and they changed the world. In England, northern settlement shaped regions, towns, language, law, and power. In Ireland, Viking-founded towns became part of trade and political life. In Normandy, people of northern origin became landholders and rulers, eventually shaping a future that would reach far beyond the coast where they first settled. In the east, Scandinavian travelers and elites became connected to powerful river-based networks and states. This is the strange peak of the Viking rise. It is not only the moment when ships are feared, it is the moment when ships become history, when a raid becomes a town, when a camp becomes a base, when a route becomes a kingdom's concern, when a foreign shore becomes home, when the people who once left the north for wealth begin to shape the lands where they arrive. This is what sea kings really means in the deeper sense, not simply men standing on ships, but leaders and communities who learned that control of movement could become control of wealth, fear, settlement, and political power. The sea was no longer only a road, it was a realm, and those who knew how to cross it, read it, survive it, and use it could rise far above the limits of the farms where the story began. Still, the peak should not be imagined as clean or peaceful. It was uneven, violent, ambitious, creative, and unstable. Viking power did not look the same everywhere. In one place, it was a fleet demanding payment. In another, a market town. In another, a settlement of farms. In another, a ruler with northern ancestors. In another, a warrior band hired by a foreign power. The Viking world was powerful because it could take many shapes. That flexibility had been there from the beginning. The household had to adapt to winter. The sailor had to adapt to weather. The trader had to adapt to markets. The raider had to adapt to resistance. The settler had to adapt to new land. At its peak, the entire Viking world became an expression of that old northern habit: survive, adjust, move, return, and try again. The Longhouse had expanded into a sea world. The small farm had sent people beyond the horizon. The boat had become a ship. The ship had become a route. The route had become a network. The network had become power, and power in time began to look like rule. This was the highest point of the rise, not only leaving the cold north, but making the cold north matter far beyond itself. A child born beside a fjord could grow up in a world where ships linked his home to silver from distant lands, stories from foreign courts, islands across the Atlantic, and towns built where earlier crews had once only landed. The horizon had changed. It was no longer only something to fear or wonder about. It had become part of life, and for a while, from the cold Atlantic to the river roads of the East, people who began in a hard northern landscape became some of the most far-reaching movers of the medieval sea. But every peak carries a cost. The same sea that gave power could take lives. The same movement that brought silver could bring loss. The same ambition that built reputation could pull families apart, create enemies, and leave people buried far from home. The rise had carried them far. Now we have to look at what that rise demanded in return. Every rise has a cost. The Viking world had grown far beyond the cold homes where it began. Ships crossed seas, routes connected distant shores. Silver moved north. Settlements appeared beyond the horizon. Leaders gathered followers. The names of northern people traveled through fear, trade, service, and story. But none of that came easily. The sea that opened the world could also take it away. A ship leaving shore was always both promise and risk. The same water that carried a crew toward wealth could break the hull, scatter the oars, tear the sail, or swallow men whose names would be spoken only by those waiting at home. A voyage could return with silver, cloth, weapons, and reputation, or it could simply not return. In the Longhouse, absence had a sound. A place near the fire left empty, a child asking when someone would come back, a wife listening to wind against the walls, an old parent looking toward the shore too often. The rise of the Vikings was built on movement, but movement meant separation. It meant people leaving farms, families, animals, fields, and familiar graves. It meant younger men chasing wealth beyond the sea, leaders risking crews for reputation, and households wading through seasons without knowing whether the ship had survived. Sea kings were not made from comfort. They were made from danger repeated often enough to become a way of life. There was also a cost for the places they reached. The Viking rise brought fear to coasts, monasteries, river towns, and settlements that had not asked to become part of the northern story. Wealth taken north was often loss somewhere else. A ring of silver in one hall could mean an empty chest in another. A reputation gained by one leader could mean grief for strangers whose names were never preserved in the same sagas. This matters. The story of the Vikings is not only a story of courage, skill, ships, and survival. It is also a story of violence, fear, and pressure, moving from one world into another. Their rise was impressive, but it was not gentle. The same ships that carried trade and settlement could carry sudden attack. The same flexibility that made them powerful also made them unpredictable. To the people of the north, the ship could be hope. To people watching from another shore, it could be terror. Both truths belong to the story. And even for the Vikings themselves, success could become dangerous. Silver created hunger for more silver. A leader who gained followers through gifts had to keep rewarding them. A crew that returned wealthy could inspire another voyage, then another. Reputation could lift a man high, but it could also trap him inside expectation. Once others believe you can bring wealth, they expect you to bring it again. Power asks to be fed. The more the Viking world expanded, the more it depended on ships, loyalty, risk, and return. A failed voyage could weaken a leader. A lost crew could damage a household. A winter in a foreign land could become a struggle for food and shelter. A settlement beyond the horizon could become isolated, hungry, or surrounded by enemies. The world had grown larger, but not safer. Even settlement carried a cost. To build a new home in Iceland, Greenland, Ireland, England, or elsewhere meant leaving the old one behind. It meant learning unfamiliar weather, soil, neighbors, laws, and dangers. It meant carrying northern habits into places where they might not fit easily. It meant conflict, adaptation, and sometimes failure. The Longhouse had taught endurance. The sea demanded more. It demanded courage, but also loss. It demanded that families accept uncertainty. It demanded that people live with the possibility that the path to greatness might lead far from home. and that not everyone who followed it would come back. There is a quiet sadness in that. Behind the great image of the Viking ship, we should imagine the people left on shore, the ones who repaired the home, stored the food, watched the animals, raised children, and waited. Their work did not become legend as often as the voyagers did, but without them, the voyages could not happen. A world of movement depends on a world that stays. The rise to sea kings was never only the rise of those who sailed. It was also carried by those who endured the cost of sailing, and this gives the story its deeper shape. The Vikings did not rise from weakness to greatness by escaping hardship. They carried hardship with them. Cold became endurance, limited land became restlessness, skill became movement, movement became wealth, wealth became power, but each step took something in return. The cost of the rise was fear, risk, separation, violence, loss, and the knowledge that the sea, which made them powerful, would never truly belong to them. No one owns the sea. A king may rule a coast, a leader may command a fleet, a crew may know a route better than anyone else, but the water remains older than all of them, darker than their ambitions, and indifferent to their names. That is why the Viking rise feels both powerful and fragile. A ship could change a life, a storm could end it, a voyage could make a leader famous, a bad season could make his people hungry again, a settlement could become a town, or disappear into memory. The peak of the Viking world was real, but it was never free from danger. Its strength came from people who learned to live with risk, and its cost was paid by everyone touched by that risk. The sailors, the families, the strangers on distant shores, and the communities that had to change because northern ships had entered their world. And yet, the rise continued, because the rewards were too great, the routes too familiar, the ships too useful, and the horizon too powerful to ignore. The next step would be the transformation from movement into rule, from raiders and settlers into leaders, from men of the sea into kings whose power reached back onto the land. The Viking rise did not end with ships moving across dark water. Movement was only the beginning. At first, the ship gave northern people reach. It allowed farmers, traders, warriors, and ambitious leaders to cross seas, enter rivers, find silver, build routes, and settle beyond the horizon. But over time, something changed. The people who once arrived as raiders, merchants, or temporary visitors began to become part of the lands they reached. They did not only take from the world anymore, they began to shape it. This is the moment when sea raiders begin to become sea kings. Not all at once, not everywhere in the same way. The Viking world was too scattered, too flexible, and too varied for one simple story. In one place, a leader might remain a raider, in another a trader, in another a settler, in another a warlord, in another a ruler who learned the slower language of land, law, tribute, faith, and diplomacy. But the direction was clear. Ships had created wealth, wealth had created followers, followers had created power, and power, if it lasted long enough, began to look like rule. A successful leader needed more than courage. He needed ships, men, gifts, alliances, reputation, and the ability to reward those who followed him. Silver helped, land helped more. A leader who could offer both became more than the captain of a voyage. He became the center of a political world. This was a great transformation. The early raider is a man of movement. The king is a man of structure. The raider appears, strikes, trades, bargains, or leaves. The king must remain. He must organize, judge, protect, tax, negotiate, reward, punish, and command. He must hold together people who may not all want the same future. He must turn temporary loyalty into something more stable than a season of sailing. For people whose rise began in cold farms and smoky longhouses, this was an enormous step. The skills of the sea had carried them outward. Now they had to learn the skills of holding power. Imagine a northern leader standing not on the deck of a ship, but inside a hall far from the place where his ancestors first farmed. Around him are followers, families, traders, local allies, former enemies, and people who now depend on his decisions. The ship is still important. The sea is still behind his power. But he can no longer live only by leaving. He must also stay. That is what rule demands. And staying changes people. In England, Ireland, Normandy, and other parts of the wider Viking world, northern leaders and settlers became woven into local politics. They fought, negotiated, married, converted, adapted, and built new identities. The line between outsider and ruler could slowly blur. A people once feared for sudden arrival could become part of the land itself. This is one of the most important truths of the Viking Age. The Vikings did not simply vanish because their ships stopped coming. Many became part of the worlds they had entered. A raiding camp could become a town. A foreign settlement could become a community. A war leader could become a lord. A lord could become a king. And the children of people who once arrived by sea could grow up seeing that distant shore as home. This was the peak of their transformation, not only to frighten coasts but to shape them, not only to cross water but to turn movement into authority, not only to return with silver but to build a world where silver, land, law, ships, and loyalty supported one another. The Sea Kings were not kings because they owned the sea. No one owns the sea. They were sea kings because the sea had made them. It had trained them, carried them, enriched them, and connected them to more worlds than the northern land alone ever could. Their power came from movement, but their legacy came when movement became rule. Still, this transformation changed the Viking world from within. The more northern leaders ruled land, the more they entered the systems of the wider medieval world. They dealt with churches, kingdoms, taxes, written law, diplomacy, inheritance, and the slow pressure of settled power. Many accepted Christianity. Many adopted local customs. Many became harder to separate from the societies around them. The sea had made them different. The land began to make them permanent. And permanence softened the old Viking way. A raider can live by surprise, a king cannot. A raider can leave disorder behind him. A king has to manage the disorder that remains. A raider needs a ship and a crew. A king needs a realm. This is why the rise to sea kings also prepared the end of the Viking Age. The very success of the Vikings changed the conditions that had created them. Their leaders became rulers. Their settlements became towns. Their roots became known. Their enemies became stronger. Their homelands became kingdoms. Their old gods slowly gave way to a new faith. The storm of movement began to settle into states. But before it settled, it changed the map. From frozen homes beside dark water, northern people had become raiders, traders, settlers, and rulers. They had turned wooden ships into roads, routes into networks, and networks into power. They had risen from the edge of the world into the center of other people's fears, markets, politics, and memories. The impossible rise had reached its royal form. The people of smoke, wood, wool, hunger, and sea had become sea kings. But no age can remain at its peak forever. And the same forces that lifted the Vikings higher would soon begin to transform them into something else. The Viking Age did not end in a single night. There was no final storm that swallowed the last longship, no single winter when every northern sail disappeared from the horizon, no moment when the people of the north suddenly stopped being what they had been. The end came more quietly. It came through change. The same world the Vikings had helped disturb began to harden around them. Kingdoms grew stronger, coasts became more defended, rulers learned to respond, towns built walls, monasteries moved treasure, hid it, or placed themselves under better protection. The sea was still open, but it was no longer as surprising as it had once been. The routes were known now, and once a route is known by both sides, surprise becomes harder. At the same time, Scandinavia itself was changing. The scattered world of farms, local leaders, halls, ships, and shifting loyalties began to form stronger kingdoms. Power became more organized. Kingship became more stable. Christianity spread through the north, changing burial, belief, law, alliance, and the way rulers connected themselves to the rest of Europe. The old Longhouse world did not vanish all at once, but it was being transformed. A leader who once gained power by sailing outward could become a Christian king, ruling land at home. A raider's son might become a landholder. A settler's grandson might speak another language, follow another law, and belong to a kingdom his ancestors first reached by ship. This is why the end of the Viking Age is not really a story of disappearance. It is a story of absorption. The Vikings became part of the worlds they had entered. In England, Ireland, Normandy, the North Atlantic, the Baltic, and the river worlds of the East, their descendants blended into new societies. Some names remained, some words remained, some towns remained, some laws, routes, stories, and memories remained. But the old pattern slowly lost its power. Sudden ships, seasonal raiding, scattered crews, shock from the sea, these things did not vanish in a single moment, but they became harder to sustain. The world had learned the Vikings, and the Vikings had learned the world. That is often how an age ends, not because its people disappear, but because its strongest habits become ordinary, regulated, settled, or transformed into something new. The ship remained, the sea remained, the northern memory remained, but the age of the sea raider was giving way to the age of kingdoms, and in that change, the impossible rise completed its circle. The people who began in cold homes at the edge of the sea had used movement to escape limits. Their movement created roots, roots created settlements, settlements created power, and power finally pulled them into the same world of states, laws, faith, and rule that they had once approached from the outside. They did not simply fall, they became something else. The storm settled into history, and beneath that history, the echo of the Longships remained. Long after the Viking Age faded, the echo of the Longships remained. The raids became stories. The sea kings became ancestors, rulers, settlers, and names carried into new kingdoms. The ships that once appeared as dark shapes on the horizon were pulled onto beaches, buried in earth, broken by time, or remembered in sagas, told beside later fires. But the world they shaped did not forget them. Their traces remained in towns, languages, trade routes, laws, graves, place names, and old stories of ships crossing cold water beneath grey skies. They remained in the memory of Dublin and York, in the northern routes of Normandy, in the island farms of the Atlantic, and in the long river paths that once carried travellers toward distant markets and empires. The rise had begun quietly, a cold longhouse, a low fire, a family sleeping close for warmth, a boat waiting above the tide, a hard land that could not give enough to everyone. From that beginning came movement. From movement came roots. From roots came silver, settlement, power, and change. The people who once seemed trapped by winter and thin soil learned to turn the sea into a road, and, for a time, that road carried them farther than anyone in the first longhouses could have imagined. They did not rise because life was easy. They rose because life was hard, and the sea offered a way outward. And perhaps that is why their story still holds us. Not only because of raids or legends, but because of the transformation beneath them. Ordinary people under pressure, learning the skills that would carry them beyond the limits of home. The storm passed, the kingdoms changed, the old ships are gone. But if you imagine the northern coast at night, with cold wind over dark water and a faint line of waves moving toward the shore, it is easy to feel why the story lasted. Somewhere in that darkness, the first road was waiting, not made of stone, not marked by gates, only water, wind, wood, and courage. And from that road, a small world rose into the age of sea kings.